Hello, my name is Father James Kelleher. I'm a priest in the Society of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity. And I'm also the founder and director of the Eucharistic Family Rosary Crusade. I do Rosary Crusades all over the United States, England, Ireland, and Central America. And today I'd like to talk with you about St. John Marie Vianney, the great Curé of Ars, the great French priest who lived in southern France. He was born in 1786 and died in 1859. And I'd like, in this talk today, to focus on how God prepared him for his mission, and how, by focusing on the Eucharist, confession, and the Blessed Virgin Mary, God used him as an instrument to bring his entire parish back to God. John was born to a humble, devout French family, and he had 5 brothers and sisters. They lived near the city of Lyon, but out in the countryside. Not long after he was born, in the year 1790, the French Revolution swept France. The anti-Catholic government went about killing many priests, and so other priests had to hide in the mountains and celebrate Mass in secret. This was the kind of environment that John and his family lived in. And so John was used to going to secret Masses held in homes by priests who were faithful and loyal to the teaching of the Church. He actually made his first Holy Communion in a private home at one of these secret Masses. As John grew and developed, his love for God deepened. And in 1802, religious freedom was restored to France, and so John was able to begin to do some minor studies. He had as his mentor a great priest named Father Bali, who really took John under his wings. John was just beginning to make some progress when the government began a big draft of young people, and John got drafted into the army. He was getting ready to report one day when he got very sick, and so he wasn't able to join his troop at the right time. When he finally recovered from his illness, he found a young man that said he could lead him back to his army regiment. But instead, the young man led John up into the mountains where there were many deserters who had fled the earlier persecution of the Church. So John had no choice but to hide in the mountains until things settled down. And so he actually lived up there for 14 months. Whenever any soldiers came in the area, they had to hide him in haystacks so the soldiers couldn't find him. But in this time, he taught the children in the area some of their class subjects. After 14 months, the government issued an amnesty for all deserters, and John was able to come back to his home area and study for the priesthood. He was sent to the major seminary in Lyon. However, John was a little bit slow intellectually. He had a hard time learning the Latin, and so the seminary sent him home. And so John went back under the training of Father Bali, the priest who was his early guide and mentor. And Father Bali stayed close to John and helped John get prepared for the priesthood. And it was Father Bali who actually convinced the Vicar General that John's great piety would sustain him as a priest, and that he had sufficient knowledge to do what a priest needed to do. And so the Vicar General finally agreed that John could be ordained in 1815. You know, when you think about your life, mentors play a big role, don't they? And John was very fortunate because his first assignment was to work 3 years with Father Bali. So he learned from a very good and holy priest how to become a very wonderful priest. A priest totally in love with Jesus in the Eucharist, and a priest ready to lay down his life for his flock. After 3 years working with Father Bali died, and so the bishop sent John to a small country parish in southern France called Ars. It only had 230 inhabitants. When John got there, he was shocked by the pagan influence in this little town, by the religious indifference that the French Revolution had brought about. People were working on Sundays, they were dancing and drinking in the taverns. They had no time for God. But John got to work. And so he devoutly celebrated Mass with 15 minutes of silent preparation in the church before he would begin celebrating the sacred mysteries. He spent a lot of time preparing his homilies. And he preached with fire. And he really challenged the people to turn away from their godless ways and to turn to the loving mercy of God. He had a great way of articulating the Father's love for each individual, for the Father's immense mercy that he'd sought to pour out on all souls. And so one by one, these once hardened parishioners began to turn to God, experienced conversion, discovered the joy of forgiveness in the sacrament of reconciliation, discovered the immense beauty of the holy sacrifice of the Mass, began to have an intimate personal relationship with Jesus in the Eucharist, and to come to know the Blessed Virgin Mary as their spiritual mother, and her role to lead us to Jesus in the Eucharist. It didn't take long for word to spread throughout France that there was a humble parish priest in Ars who spent 10 to 14 hours a day in the confessional, bringing hardened sinners back to God, helping people who were carrying heavy burdens to find comfort in the Lord. From 1827 to 1857, these people were coming from all over the world, and by 1857, 20,000 people a year were coming to Ars to see the curé, to go to confession to the curé. And you can imagine how difficult this life was, because John led a very prayerful, penitential life. Most of the time for dinner, he just had boiled potatoes. He practiced regular penance and fasting. And he spent long periods of time in front of the Blessed Sacrament, just adoring Jesus, listening to Jesus, allowing Jesus to strengthen him, so that he could spend that 10 to 14 hours a day in the confessional. Well, it wasn't easy, and John really longed for a monastic life, and he actually left Ars on 4 different occasions with the goal of entering a monastery. But he would get 1, 2, 10, 20 miles away, and the Holy Spirit would tell him, John, you've got to go back. Your people need you. And so in humble obedience, he would go back to Ars and continue this rigorous, grueling service that he was so dedicated to giving to his people because of his great love for Jesus, crucified and resurrected. You know, St. John Vianney's love for the Eucharist, his great sacrifice for his people, his humility, his prayer, they all speak to you and me of how you and I can grow in our life of holiness with the Lord. So let us each turn to St. John Vianney and ask him to help us in our prayer life. Ask him to help us in our preparation for receiving Jesus in the Eucharist. Ask him to give us the humility to come before the Lord in simplicity when we go to confession, and just present ourselves to the Lord and let the Lord's mercy forgive and heal us. In John Vianney, we have a great saint. Ave Maria.